Hello everyone, welcome to part 3 of the Evolution of Building series of presentations that I'm recording. Today I'm going to be talking about ancestral roof assemblies and the lessons that we can learn from the way that our ancestors built roofs. In the past couple of presentations in this series, I talked about ancestral walls and I also explored ancestral foundations. And today in part 3, we're going to be looking at the lessons we can learn from ancestral roof assemblies and take a bit of a dive into different methods of roofing that were used and looking at some of the wisdom that we lost along the way when we decided to move into modern times. What I found with ancestral roofs is actually super fascinating, and in particular one type of roof assembly that I thought was going to be kind of silly, and I thought, oh, good thing we've progressed from that, has turned out to be one of the more fascinating in terms of its ability to manage moisture in really intelligent ways than I ever could have imagined. I'm super excited to share what I learned with you guys today. Before we begin, just wanted to make a quick note. I am not an engineer. Nothing here is professional advice. I'm outlining basic principles of moisture management through a lens informed by ancestral building wisdom and offering suggestions on how these principles can be applied to best practices if someone wants to build an ancestral style roof in modern times. If you're planning a project on your own though, always work with a qualified engineer to ensure that the design meets your site, climate, and structural requirements. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's get on with this. So when people think of ancestral roofs, they'll often picture the cladding material. So that would be like the thatch roof or the cedar shakes or the slate tiles. And those indeed are the three actually that I'm going to be focusing on today. But the roofing system is much more than just the cladding, just the part that we see. What actually makes these roofs work and what made them work in the past was the physics of the entire roof assembly. So we are going to look a little bit at how roofs were made in the past by and large and how we do them today, where the differences lie and where we might be kind of failing in our current way of creating roofs and why our current roofs often do fail. So I'm going to start with the ancestral roof assembly, the basic way that roofs used to be structured before modern times. And there were certainly many variations of traditional roof assemblies across regions and cultures, but one key point is absolutely consistent. There was no continuous roof deck the way that we build today. Materials like plywood and OSB, which is what the roof deck is made out of, did not exist. Instead of using that solid sheet of plywood or OSB, all structural stability back then came from the timber framework itself. So from the rafters, from purlins, from struts, from ties, from hangers, all working together to create that rigid triangulated structure. We'll focus on three key elements of the ancestral roofing system here. The rafters running up at an angle to meet at the ridge, the purlins running horizontally to stiffen and support the rafters, and the battens, which are small horizontal strips that the roof cladding attaches to. Just if you're like me, and before I started reading about construction and about building science, I didn't really understand much about building. But if you're like I was, this is a handy, very simple diagram to show you what I'm talking about. So the rafters are those wooden beams that come up, run from the walls up to the ridge, create that kind of triangular structure there. And then the purlins, there were the horizontal beams that ran across the rafters to add that strength and support. So traditional roof assemblies were made of unmilled wood. The rafters were made of oak, chestnut, fir, or pine, and the purlins were made normally of the same. And the battens were split from smaller wood, often things like hazel or willow. The rafters and purlins were usually made up of whole logs with the bark removed, and they might have been hewn flat by an axe, and the battens were split along the grain. All of this was long before the days of the handy 2x4s and factory-made trusses that we see in roof assemblies today. So the first type of cladding I want to talk about today is a thatch roof. Now, in the past, when I thought about, before properly reading about this, I was like, oh, straw roof, that seems kind of quaint, cool, I guess. Good thing we don't have those anymore. But I was actually completely blown away when I read about how incredibly intelligent thatch roofs actually are and how widely they were actually used throughout history. Thatch is one of the oldest roofing systems that humans ever used. It even spans back as far as the Stone Age, which is 50,000 years ago. Its use ran through the Neolithic Age, through the Bronze Age, through the Middle Ages, even in other parts of the world, in other cultures. In Japan, it was used for over 5,000 years. In Africa and in indigenous North America, it was used for thousands of years as well. So that ubiquity of use across cultures really speaks to the fact that there must have been something inherently intelligent about this type of roofing. Of course, the exact materials that were used in different places would have varied just based on what was available, the exact plants, but just the fact that it was so widespread makes it seem like there's something that we should pay attention to here. Its use did decline, however, when fired clay tiles, metal roofing, and industrial sawmills became more common, with the Industrial Revolution. 1800s was when those sort of ways of building and materials became much more widely available. It was made of dried plants, so the long stalks of dried plants, and they were bundled and layered in overlapping courses on the roof. So the materials, the plants that were used often were things like straw, so wheat, rye, and oats. Also, reeds from wetland plants were actually the most durable sort of material, so where that was available, that was definitely used. And grasses would have been used as well. So thatch roofs are not waterproof, but they are very water shedding in the way that a duck's feathers would shed water. And thatch is a great water shedder because of several things, and this is where it got really fascinating from a moisture management perspective. I was blown away at how clever thatch is. So each dense bundle contains hundreds of tightly packed stems, so that water reed or the wheat straw or the rye straw, and those are compressed together and tied and fixed to the roof itself, and that will create a shingling effect with the butt end facing upslope and the tips were facing downslope. The surface tension path was consistently interrupted because of that shingling effect, so with every overlap, that would function like a miniature drip edge. And so the water film would break, and then that would prevent upward wicking of water. And also the steep roof pitch, you'll see again and again in ancestral roofs, by and large, they had a very steep pitch. The steep roof pitch, you'll see again and again, ancestral buildings tended to have very steep roof pitches, quite a steep slope. That would help to shed the water as well. And another really cool thing is that capillary action was actually interrupted. So if you need a little primer on what capillary action is, it's just the tendency of a lot of materials to wick moisture in. So for example, modern concrete is very capillary active. It will wick water inward if it doesn't have a proper capillary break. That's that kind of rising damp phenomenon. I thought before I started reading about thatch that it would be very capillary active, but it's actually not, which is so cool. It's made up of large hollow stems with smooth surfaces that do not allow for tight contact between the fibers, so the water can't bridge from one stem to the next within that bundle. It's like trying to wick water along a bundle of drinking straws. While the thatch material is tightly packed, the gaps between the stems are still too large, 0.5 to 3 millimeters, for capillary rise to occur. That is 10 to 100 times too large for capillary action, for that capillary rise to happen. It seems like small spaces, and it is, but it's still too big of pores to create that surface tension, that capillary drive needed to create capillary action. So that was super cool. So many things about thatch that I didn't even realize. So very ingenious roofing method that was used for millennia. A thatch roof will dry out rapidly with air movement as well. And as I was saying before, the ancestral roof assemblies didn't have that roof deck that modern roofs do. So the thatch attached directly to the rafters or purlins, and that allowed it to dry out rapidly. Thatch is a very breathable material. It is vapor open, and it has some permeability to air, making it very amenable to drying. That air movement meant that it would dry very rapidly. It also had moisture buffering properties. It's something called a hygroscopic material, which just means that it can store and release moisture without being damaged. So small humidity swings could be absorbed by the roof, which would help to stabilize indoor humidity. Again, of course, the caveat here is that you can't have it soaking wet. It can't be sitting soaking wet for ages. It will eventually rot, but it has some ability to absorb moisture and let it go if that airflow is there. And it is a good insulator as well, which was kind of unusual for roofing materials at this time. So for context, a 12-inch thick thatch roof made of straw could have an R value of R28 to R36. That's R2.3 to R3 per inch, not too shabby. And also it has thermal mass-like behavior. So it's not got thermal mass the way that, brick or rammed earth wall would have in terms of that heat storage capacity. But because of how densely packed the fibers are and because it has moisture buffering capacity, that has an effect of thermal lag. So it will slow the heat transfer down. So for example, if sun is hitting the roof at noon, it might only make its way inside by sort of late evening. And finally, it has a really great acoustic mass, which just means it absorbs sound really well. So wind noise would be absorbed. There wouldn't be the roar of rain hitting the thatch roof. So I can imagine that life in a thatch roof home would have been quite peaceful. I wanted to just say a bit of a word on modern thatch roofs. I know there are quite a few people out there interested in ancestral building methods in the modern day, and that is so cool. So just a few words on making sure that if you do want to do a thatch roof these days, that you are going to do it in a way that's got some longevity to it. First thing is, don't attach it directly to the roof deck. You'll likely be using a solid roof deck rather than a fully traditional roof assembly, and you don't want rotten thatch. I mean, if you do a completely traditional roof assembly, amazing, but that's harder to come by these days. So you'll want to maintain that dedicated air gap between the deck, the roof deck, and the thatch, typically by installing battens over the deck and fastening the thatch to those. I'll show you an image of that in the next slide. Just as a side note, you'll want to make sure you detail the perimeter of that air gap carefully to prevent pests from entering that ventilation space. Traditional materials like thatch do require traditional assembly logic. I have seen some advice indicating that as long as you have a waterproof underlayment under the thatch, you're fine to attach it directly to a roof deck. My take would be to stick to the ancestrally tried method of keeping airflow above and below the thatch. The risk of rot, in my opinion, is just too high otherwise. Also, just a note that thatch roofs will not last forever. Well-maintained one might last for a while. Water-reed thatch roofs in the past lasted the longest, typically 30 to 60 years and sometimes more. And straw thatch roofs could last 15 to 30 years, depending on climate, pitch, material quality, and craftsmanship, in modern days as well. The materials you choose, the way that you create the roof assembly, the amount of breathing, like airflow that you allow, that's all going to affect it. But do be aware that you are going to need to replace this thatch roof. And the final word I'm going to say here is that there is a real fire risk. As amazing as thatch is, so many super cool qualities, there is a risk of fire with it. That stuff will light up. So this is just an illustration that I found showing the installation of a thatch roof assembly here, the thatch roof cladding, I guess, onto the assembly. So you'll see that there are the battens and counter battens. They're sort of creating that lattice network that you see in this image, and you see that there's an underlayment as well, something that's probably resistive to water, weather resistant, water resistant barrier there, and you'll want to have all of that if you're installing a thatch roof onto a modern roof assembly. The next type of roof cladding that I'm going to be discussing is wooden shakes and shingles. In wooded regions, people use whatever local species that have the right natural properties for roofing. It's been used for thousands of years across Europe, Asia, North America, and common choices included things like cedar, oak, chestnut, pine, larch, and aspen. These woods were preferred because they would split cleanly and easily into shakes. They had a good natural rot resistance, and they were stable enough to handle repeated wetting and drying cycles as well. So in case you're like me and didn't understand what the difference between shakes and shingles were or are, I didn't until I started reading about building, but I will just give you a little primer. Shakes are basically the more ancestral version of shingles. They were thicker, rougher, and hand-split pieces of wood. They are actually still available today as well. Both shingles and shakes are available today. They just come at a bit of a premium. They follow the natural grain and have a more textured surface, which sheds water really well, actually, and I'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. Shingles are just thinner and smoother, more uniform, and they only came about with mechanical sawmills, so in more modern times. So shakes were fastened to the battens, again, not to a solid roof deck because those didn't exist yet. Because the shakes were fastened only along their upper edges and the battens were spaced apart, the lower portions of the shakes never lay flat against a solid surface. Their natural taper and irregular split surfaces meant that each shake touched the one below it at only a few points, which created a web of tiny gaps and channels. And those irregular overlaps really let air move freely behind the shake layer, helping the whole roof stay dry. And that was also aided by a good slope. Because the shakes didn't stay saturated for long, rot was not as likely to happen. That being said, regular replacement of wood shakes was still needed. The longer lasting woods included western red cedar, chestnut, oak, larch, and aspen, but you would need to know that you were going to be replacing that roof every 20 to 60 years, just depending on the conditions, I guess, how much rain the place received, how much sun it received. I mean, we have to be aware that the roof takes a beating, like it takes all of the weather, it takes all of the sun. So it's normal to have to replace a roof at some regular interval, and we should be aware of that these days as well. I think sometimes we just think, oh, it's fine until it starts leaking, right? But we should be a little more proactive and just understand that things like roofs do need replacing. So in terms of a modern wood, shingle, or shake roof assembly, if you wanted to do something like that, similar as with thatch, you'll likely be using a solid roof deck rather than a fully traditional assembly. And again, you'll want to maintain that dedicated air gap between the roof deck and the wood shingles. Might be a similar sort of system with battens. In this illustration here, it's called skip sheathing. It looks like in this illustration they also have some sort of a mesh to allow breathing. So a few different options out there, a few different ideas to create that air gap in the modern day. Also, that steep roof pitch, again, key to keeping the shakes or shingles dry. And if you're considering wood today, cedar is a great option, still out there. It is naturally rot resistant and it performs really well in wet climates. There are other good options out there, including redwood, cypress, and larch. What's available is really going to depend on where you're located, what it is available in your region. You will see both shingles and shakes on the market today. Shingles, again, are thinner, more uniform, and cheaper. Shakes are thicker, rough split, and more durable, usually worth the extra cost just for their longevity. So the third type of roof cladding I'm going to be discussing today, the ancestral type, is stone tiles, specifically slate I'll be looking at. That was used so widely by many of our ancestors, so I thought it was worth a deeper dive, and it's a really fascinating material. It's been used for roofing for thousands of years in many regions worldwide, from Europe to parts of China and India. Really, wherever slate was available, it was adopted as roofing. It was just such an ideal roofing material. It splits naturally into thin and durable sheets, making it easy to shape into roofing tiles without using complex tools. There are two types of slate. One is hard slate, which is waterproof, and the other one is soft slate, which is just water shedding. Both are fireproof and rot proof. So slate is remarkably durable. Hard slate will last up to 200 or more years. Soft slate, still pretty impressive, up to 75 years, 20 to 75 year range for the soft slate. It does weather faster, it absorbs more water, so it doesn't last as long, but still pretty cool. So one of the downfalls is it is quite heavy, making it hard to transport, and it will require really solid framing underneath it. So, timber framing, like a solid timber framing would have been adequate for it, or like a solid mass wall like rammed earth would have held this up quite well. And, modern well-engineered builds will be able to hold up a slate roof as well. And just in terms of the roof assembly, similar to the others that we discussed, in terms of, attaching kind of directly to the rafters, the battens or whatever with an air gap behind, like you didn't have it attached to a sheathing because that didn't exist yet. So in terms of modern slate roofs, same as with thatch and wood shingles, just avoid attaching the slate directly to the roof deck. That might not seem obvious because stone slate is probably not going to rot, right? Especially if you're using the hard slate. But honestly, without ventilation, you get small leaks, capillary water getting in can cause the roof deck to get wet and rot. So even stone needs a ventilated assembly. And interestingly, slate was one of the more vapor closed materials available in nature before, plastics came along in industrial times and modern times. But even with that, there was an understanding in ancestral times that really needed to not be right up against something else. We really needed to allow a bit of a gap there, especially on the roof, which is taking so much moisture. So in terms of soft versus hard slate, just with soft slate, if you opt for the cheaper soft slate material, you would expect to replace it more frequently, and hard slate would be more durable. So soft slate more prone to hail damage, hard slate is going to be more durable, though a really large golf ball size hail, the way we get here in Calgary, still has the potential to cause an issue. And again, a steep roof pitch, as with all ancestral roof assemblies, is generally a really good idea. As some of you might know who have watched some of my previous videos, I do like to apply Nassim Nicholas Taleb's Lindy Principle to architecture, and that is the idea that what has lasted for a long time did so for a reason. There is merit to looking at what worked for millennia to see what we forgot when progress and technology took over. The striking thing is that our modern roofs often fail in ways that our ancestors probably could never have imagined. So the ancestral principle that is really obvious when you think about it, and building science is elucidating that more and more these days, but that somehow we forgot, or somehow our buildings by and large don't manage, is that, well, really any assembly, but here I'm talking about roofs. Roofs have to shed and release moisture faster than they can accumulate it. And there were some main lessons that I kind of pulled out of all of this reading that I've done on ancestral roof assemblies that I'm going to go through here in the rest of this presentation. So ancestral roofs succeeded because they were really simple in shape, they had a steep slope, and they were able to breathe and able to dry. So let's look at that more in detail. So modern day lesson number one is we want to keep our roof assemblies ventilated, as you can glean, as you can imagine from what I've already talked about. So the closest modern day equivalent of the ancestral battens, purlins, type of roof with all of that ventilation happening, with all of that air exposure, is a vented cold roof in modern times. So I'll just go through what a vented cold roof is briefly in general terms. So in modern times, we were going to have a ceiling, which is going to be like the floor of the attic, the ceiling of the enclosed building envelope. So the ceiling inside of the house keeps the warm, moist air out of the roof. It is airtight, it's made of often drywall, an airtight membrane, and all of the penetrations are sealed. There's going to be an insulation layer above the ceiling. So that's often blown in cellulose, blown in fiberglass, it might be mineral wool bats. You'll have the roof rafters, the roof structure itself. Often in the modern day, there's pre-made roof trusses that are used, and the roof deck will attach to those rafters, the trusses. You'll have that ventilated attic, which is just the space between the insulation, which is above the ceiling of the house, and the roof deck, and that's the cold attic space. And ventilation is created via soffit vents for air intake and ridge vents for air going out. So you've got that natural buoyancy of air. You can see the soffit vents there under the eaves, and then the ridge vents at the top, sort of at the ridge of the roof. And you have that, the buoyancy of warm air is going to cause that continuous circulation of air through that ventilated attic space. The roof deck is going to be made up of plywood or OSB, and that's going to cover the rafters. It creates that solid surface where the underlayment and shingles normally attach to, and it helps to stiffen and sort of create structure with the entire roof structure. The underlayment is often going to be plastic, like polyethylene. It is often vapor closed, and then the roof cladding goes right on top of that most of the time. Things like asphalt shingles normally are used in modern day. So more on keeping the modern day roof ventilated. So most modern roof assemblies have shingles attached directly to the roof deck, as I was just saying. Ancestral roofs did not have a roof deck, as we already talked about quite a bit. The modern option here, if you are going to use a modern roof assembly with a roof deck, is to keep an air vent behind the cladding above the roof deck. So you can do that with a system of battens and counter battens that support the roof cladding while maintaining that continuous air gap for drying. So that air movement above the roof deck is really quite desirable. It will carry away moisture and heat, and it will reduce things like ice damming as well. You won't be able to use things like asphalt shingles because those are designed to attach directly to the roof deck, but there are materials out there that will allow you to have that air gap. One of them is a metal roofing system. Metal roofs are already corrugated, which will allow some air space just by the fact that they have those corrugations, and they can be installed on top of battens as well, so you can really create quite an air gap there. Also, cedar shakes or shingles, slate tiles, those can all attach to battens, and you can have that ventilated and drainage sort of plane with those. Again, that airspace should be protected. Without proper detailing, it can become a haven for pests. So just make sure that you detail it. You can get metal mesh closures that allow the air to move freely while keeping pests out at the same time. Modern day lesson number 2 is use moisture forgiving materials in your roof assemblies. So things like mineral wool insulation. It's a great material, very widely available. It's called rock wool, is generally the brand name that's out there. It doesn't rot and it doesn't absorb much moisture, so it's quite forgiving. It doesn't tend to cause issues very quickly. Also, materials like wool and cellulose are hygroscopic. It means that they can withstand some moisture before they start to rot. They can take moisture in and release it. The caveat, of course, is that they're not magic. They still need to be allowed to dry in time, especially things like cellulose. It will at some point reach a saturation where rot will set in, so you still need to allow for drying it. There's just a little bit more forgiveness. And I'm going to say as well that it's a good idea to avoid vapor closed materials when you can. To have drying blocked, hoping that water's never going to get behind a vapor closed material just seems like a recipe for failure. So there are thankfully some modern day vapor permeable roof underlayments that you could use instead of an impermeable plastic. Things like Solitex Mento, Siga, Magcoat are products out there that are designed to block liquid water while still allowing vapor to escape. Modern day lesson number 3 is that we want to keep roofs simple and steep. So I've gone on and on about the pitch of the roof, so I think you get it. But just sort of to give it, to hammer the point home and to like give some more numbers here. With thatch, you want to have a 45 to 55 degree slope. So that's in a rise or a run sort of way of expressing it. That's 12 to 12 or 17 to 12 sort of pitch. With shakes or shingles or slate sort of roofs, it's normally at least a 35 degree or 8 to 12 sort of pitch of roof. So in terms of a steep pitch, there are many benefits of it. It increases water shedding. It reduces capillary penetration. If the water doesn't sit there, it doesn't have a chance to absorb in. It's quicker to shed snow, which lessens the chance of ice damming. It reduces the impact of hail. The hail is going to be hitting instead of straight down, it's going to be hitting on an angle, so it'll be less force coming into the roof as a result of that. For a high performing water shedding roof, a good rule of thumb is to aim for about a 45 degree pitch or a 12 to 12 pitch. This is just to talk about what some of the things you really want to avoid. Some of these modern roofs I see, I'm like, what the heck are they thinking? So things that are kind of asking for failure are things like multi-valley roofs, weird angles, shallow pitches, those, flat roofs. They're never entirely flat. They need to have a bit of a pitch, but not enough. I can't tell you how many times I've seen in Vancouver where it rains almost nonstop, just puddles on these, shallow pitch roofs, which I'm just like, who thought that was a good idea? Anyways, I won't go on about that too long. And you want to avoid intersecting roofs, complicated junctions. So just keep it super simple. Just a normal, triangle sort of shape roof. Just easy, guys. Not sure why we decided to go a little crazy with roofs. Modern day lesson number 4 would be large overhangs. So the big hat idea. Overhangs are one of the most powerful moisture management tools that we have. They keep weather off of the walls to begin with. Seems so logical, right? So ancestral materials like rammed earth, wattle and daub, and timber were all quite moisture sensitive, and our ancestors understood that. For some reason in the modern day, we decided water didn't really matter, and we're like so high and mighty with all of our technology that we don't need to worry about large overhangs, so we'll just have water dripping along the walls because that's a great idea, right? That being said, with all of our waterproofing membranes and of all of our technology, our modern buildings fail within a mortgage cycle almost always. They're built to fail, which I think is just in so many ways such a bad idea. It's terrible for the environment. It's an extremely wasteful way of being. It's terrible for our children, not only because of the environment we're leaving for them, but also for the fact that, this is a way of transferring security and wealth to our children. And why would we want to create something that's just going to fall apart? Anyways, tangent. So we decided that overhangs weren't a good idea, and we just don't really make these big overhangs anymore. But one of the simplest and most powerful things we can do is to have a large overhang with our roofs, protecting our walls. Modern day lesson number 5 is understanding stack effect. So our ancestors might not have understood exactly the pressure differentials that were happening with stack effect, but because of how leaky to air ancestral houses were, you ended up with a lot of cold air coming in through inadvertent cracks in the lower structure of the house, and then the warm air would rise within the building and it would exit through cracks and inadvertent air cracks, air openings in the top part of the house and through the roof, through the ceiling and the roof as well. So you would have this constant flow, this constant circulation of air. The ventilation was inadvertent, but it was effective. And that meant that there was really not a lot of pressure buildup at the top of the structure. And the sheer amount of air and heat that kept circulating meant that moisture didn't really have a chance to build up and cause damage. Now, in the modern day, most of us aren't super keen to live in a cold home, huddled around a fire with layers of wool sweaters on throughout the winter. Though I would argue that was a very different way of life, and I actually see some merit to going back to something like it. The realities of trying to accomplish that is a different story, and that's, a topic of discussion for sure, but nonetheless, we do live in the modern day, and that is the way that our buildings are built in terms of our thermal comfort. Yeah, the reality of our modern thermal comfort demands really is that warm conditioned air creates a stack effect, meaning that moisture-laden indoor air is constantly trying to escape out the top, and a lot of pressure builds up towards the top of the building. If we want the modern comforts, we also need to actually be diligent about keeping the building envelope airtight. Otherwise, a lot of moisture will escape into the attic, and warm, moist air leaking into the modern attic in a heating climate means condensation, means attic rain, means ice damming, means soaked insulation, means mold and roof deck rot. So lots of air leakage in a modern home with modern materials and modern thermal demands means bad news, guys. The redundancy here, as we have discussed, is that if some small amount of air and moisture do get into the attic, which some small amount will, even if we detail it really well, a little bit will get into there. We want it to be well ventilated. We want it to be vapor open. We want to use moisture tolerant materials to encourage that fast drying. So we do want to create as airtight as possible in the modern day, but then we have that ancestral principle of quick drying if and when some moisture does get into the attic space. Just wanted to put a quick side note here. We do need intentional ventilation indoors these days. We don't have that passive, inadvertent ventilation of days of yore. So we need to use, modern HVAC or HRV, ERV sort of systems to create proper ventilation. And want to make sure those are well maintained as well, because those can be havens for bacterial growth and grossness and bad indoor air. So, yes, I did want to put a word on airtightness in here, because there's so much misunderstanding that I see out there in terms of what it means for a house to be able to breathe. People often assume, I've even seen professionals that I've paid a lot of money to tell me things like, oh, a little bit of leakiness is good because it's like ventilation. That is really only true when your entire house is made in an ancestral way. It's an ancestral house with ancestral materials. You can't ignore shoddy workmanship in a modern build and call it a well-ventilated assembly. Just doesn't work. Ancestral houses and roofs were very leaky to air, poorly insulated, high airflow, high heat loss, rapid drying. Moisture almost never stayed trapped long enough to cause damage. Modern buildings are relative to that, tightly sealed, even if they're leaky by modern standards. They're too tight to allow for that rapid drying. If you do get air leaks in a modern build, that rapid temperature change and condensation surfaces within the wall mean water damage and rot. So we do, unfortunately, in modern names, need to aim for air tightness within the building envelope. Roof assembly, different thing, ventilated roof. But within the building envelope, we do need to go for airtight in the modern day. So just my closing thought after my little rant on airtightness and ventilation and breathability and what that means in modern day versus ancient times, and my yearning for simpler days and huddling by a fire in the cold winter instead of living in these weird airtight homes. So my closing thought is most of us aren't going to go back to living exactly the way our ancestors did. But would you consider it? And in what ways do you think it would be better? Do you think it would be worse in some ways? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, because this is something I've been thinking about a lot in the last little while. So my last little slide just left over from my last presentation, and I think it really still rings true to what I'm trying to accomplish here, to where my heart lies, and that is that we should learn from history, but we shouldn't romanticize it. Sometimes I do a little bit, but the realities probably of the past. I'm sure there were many harsh realities in the past, and we're dealing with harsh realities of a different type today. That being said, I do think that there is something in ancestral wisdom, and that ancestral wisdom combined with a modern understanding is our best recipe for success in today's world. So yeah, I'm going to continue to create educational content, solutions-oriented guidance, and provide insight into chronic illness and air quality. That is where my passion and my heart lies. If you're still here, so happy to have had you along the way. Do like, comment, and subscribe. I love to hear what you're thinking. And if you are enjoying this content, do hit subscribe, because then you'll get more of the content coming from me. All right. Hope you enjoyed. I loved talking about this. I loved reading about this, and I will see you next time. Take care.